Sometimes, unbidden, a voice calls out, speaking to the void.
Start at the beginning.
It commands. When it comes to role-playing games, the decade of the 2010s has had its fair share of start-at-the-beginning fads. In large part, this has been an exploration of White Box, the seminal edition of Dungeons & Dragons. For Traveller fans, it's been a revisitation of the Little Black Books of 1977. But there's not been much talk in the way of revisiting the first campaign settings put to print. This video is going to be an exploration of the very first campaign setting published for D&D. The public's eyes first spied this beast in 1977. This video will introduce you to the Wildlands of high fantasy. To this day, it's almost unique, and in some ways singular in that it's both so granular. It originally introduced itself 5-mile hexes at a time, a sheet 52 hexes wide by 34 hexes high, eventually reaching 15 of these sheets arrayed 3 wide by 5 high. Each 5-mile hex was keyed with its dungeons, with its inhabitants. And there's the rub. The Wildlands is also more protean, like clay in the Game Master's hands, than almost anything to follow. In its original form, it'll tell you that there's a nest of crocodiles in Hex 0301, and a village of sea elves in Hex 0413. Sometimes it will hint that the sea elves are having trouble with a hag stealing away their children in the night, but that is often as far as it will go in sketching out what we would think of as the beginnings of a story. The saga of these realms is in large part for you to invent. And speaking of inventing, that very hex at a time, this is what's here, this is what's there style of supplement, and that's really great for exploration-based play. The kind of gaming where you're playing to discover, a sensibility that's fallen out of favor lately, sometimes in the primacy of story, sometimes in the name of illusionism, but it's also a sensibility seeing a return to form in a lot of new systems, not in the least of which is Forbidden Lands, the hot new hex-crawling, Dawn After the Doomsday OSR lethality game from Free League out of Sweden. As an aside, Forbidden Lands is one place where I'm feeling keen to use the Wildlands. I'm sure in 1977, a lot of tables used the Wildlands and saw it as a tool for that kind of mostly out-of-character campaign that's halfway to being a hex encounter war game. After all, a great many of the early players in the hobby came from that hobby and moved into RPGs, taking a lot of the same tastes with them. And maybe that was a turnoff to some newcomers in the hobby back in 1977. But for me, sitting here in the latter day, the Wildlands feels like a great tool for me to use as the GM to just focus on role-playing the world, maintaining the verisimilitude and the cause and effect. The temptation to try and put my finger on the sum of the scales is whisked away, and I get to be more creative on other fronts, especially because the check is so blank. The Wildlands is also set apart from the vast majority of its latter-day siblings in that it has an air of being more alike to late antiquity and the early classical period, those days of Babylon, Tyre, Troy, Alexander the Great, and Rome, than it is akin to a medieval world. What do I mean by that? Well, in those days, civilization was young. Civilization, kingdoms ruling over territories. Well, the neat and tidy borders didn't fill up the whole map. To begin, cities were little oases of civilization in an ocean of barbarism. Yet this emphatically didn't make them into allies. Instead, all it took was one wrestling match to gain dominion and place one's puppet on the throne of a rival city. But one season of audacious campaigning, a prince could double his power base. Suffice it to say, the defenders know this. Dreading conquest by their betters, they volunteer tribute, gold, slaves, hostages of the royal blood, up the food chain. And yet, an even greater doom threatens the cities, the hordes of uncivilized folks who bow to no king and till no fields. Their warrior spirit remains ever sharp, and the men of the cities, meanwhile, dilute their prowess with craft and culture. At any moment, a barbarian warlord could, on a caprice, decide he wants to become the new king of your city, or merely sack it for its riches. The hinterlands are full to the brim of non-monstrous enemies, and monstrous ones, in a way you don't often see in medieval settings. Naval power, thus, is a fulcrum. Without good roads and countryside filled with manors and peasants, an army on the march overland has little to nourish itself. The density of the loci of trade is out of balance with the density of people eager to rob caravans. So even though ships are small and tossed about on the wine-dark sea, their comparative advantage is greater. The Wilderlands echo with the prowess of the Phoenician sea kings. They loom with the peril of the sea peoples, those mysterious barbarians that came across the sea and ended Egypt. The cities of the Wilderlands are just as likely to fight at sea as Persia and Greece did, as Rome and Carthage did. Of course, the weak grip of kings and their loose mastery over the lands means that any captain can easily turn pirate and find a cove that can become his own private kingdom, and the physical geography of the Wilderlands is in some ways more akin to the Caribbean than it is to the Mediterranean. The memory lingers of great empires that held dominion over the entire known world. The counterparts of Persia, Egypt, Alexander. They've left their respective marks, and while they are gone centuries or millennia, there's a certain hope in the heart of every soldier and king that he'll be able to achieve that impossible dream of world conquest. But the evidence says that this isn't impossible, and so they dream. The next thing that beckons a younger gamer to the Wilderlands is the weird and wonderful grindhousey Appendix N kind of feel to it. The original booklets were sometimes on newsprint, and the original art often had the look of Savage Sword of Conan or Prince Valiant. It very much feels like the kind of world that was informing Gygax and Arneson, a fresh and funky, genre-bending mix of occasional sci-fi elements, and throughout a heavy aroma of sword and sorcery. They're called the Wilderlands of high fantasy, but they're really much more like a trip into the mind's eye of the earliest generation of gamers. There were fewer rules about when a relic laser pistol would cross paths with a noble elf of the Elder race, or that the sword and sorcery tropes of human sacrifice and palace intrigue would intertwine with, the normal quests for relics to save the world. And they all do intersect, sometimes concurrently, in the Wilderlands. So that's 3.5 reasons why the Wilderlands are worth your study. Now let's get under the hood with this setting. After all, getting down into the weeds of campaign settings is where my YouTube channel cut its teeth. And what is Galadriel whispering at us again? Start at the beginning.